played a very central and important character. And it was very, and, in that sense it's very different from a lot of the ARGs, where you sort of like, as a community, you play an important role. In this case, as an individual, you played an important character who had a very secretive role. And Social really spoiled that, because as soon as it says, like, would you like to tweet that you have personally blackmailed the government? It just didn't feel right. It really interrupted and destroyed the social experience. And so we made this much more linear, and again, Lucas's talents also were, a big part in sort of shaping that. Just as a kind of a call out to everybody who's been working on this project with me, like, the project is so much bigger and more beautiful than it ever was in my mind, which I think is an indication that you're working with the right people. Oftentimes in games, when you create the project, you're like, well, it's not as cool as I thought it would be. And this is a very different experience for me. It's much cooler than I thought it would ever be, because I brought on people whose minds were just like, they existed in a different space, and they were able to make contributions that I would never have been able to make alone. So it's this crazy interplay between individuals' talents and technology and story and social. And I wish I could give you a hard and fast rule as to like how to do that and make something cool out of it. Of course, next year when Extra Solar is a giant flop, maybe you'll say, maybe it won't be a big deal that I didn't give you rules for how to make it work.
Yeah, I'm just coming into it as a writer. Every time I'm trying to figure out how can we get this story point across. It's like, what are the capabilities that the game has to get that story across? And when you're talking about, you get a photo every 6 hours. How do you tell a story? I mean, that's the game mechanic, is you get a new photo every 6 hours from where you've explored, and now you have to tell a story with that mechanic.
Right.
And how do you make that work, and sort of the communication between you and the people you're working for, and no spoilers, but it's really interesting seeing that back and forth. Yeah.
I have a question, and that is, how have you dealt with, through your iterative design process, and dealing with spatial mapping and mental mapping of the players' space, because they got this opportunity. I guess they have a kind of a map of like, I want the thing to go here and take a picture, but like, they're not really getting an idea of what it looks like, except every 6 hours. Like, did you run into problems, people kind of trying to wrap their head around that? Did you have to make design changes or considerations, or did it work kind of as intended?
It's worked fairly well from the very beginning. I put in a lot of visual cues. The entire island that you're exploring has a series of dikes, of stone dikes that run north to south, and they all slant at about 30 degrees to the west. And for me, the idea was people who start to become familiar with that space should be able to view any image and immediately know exactly what direction you're facing, subconsciously and instinctively. So I don't know that any of our players have actually noticed that. I don't think you even knew that, right? Like, I don't think most of our team even knows that. But it was very important to me to give these sorts of visual cues so that players could very quickly, easily, and subconsciously make a connection between what they see on the 2D map and what they see in the 3D view.
Yeah, I have a feeling that probably, even though people aren't picking up on that, like, oh, those bridges were really helpful, I bet that that's a huge element of it, just coming from like a background of geography and orientation. Like in Vancouver, which is where I live, like, everyone subconsciously orients north to the mountains. Right. And so it's this wayfinding technique that the city is actually finally started to build into the city's wayfinding. And all of a sudden people like, oh, these signs are great, they're so useful. It's like, well, thank you for finally figuring out how people wayfind in the city.
You probably already know this, but Disney has some really great lessons on like how they built the Disney theme parks, where you can see the castle from anywhere, and they have these things, they call them weenies. Yeah. It's like a visual weenie is what they call them, but they have all these techniques to draw people in one direction, and then from that position they'll see like 3 to 4 other opportunities of clear places to go, and it draws through the park, it disperses the crowd in a natural way, and kind of simultaneously hides big chunks of the crowd from the rest of the crowd, so you feel like it's a much more special and personal space. And there's a lot of, like, if you're designing any physical space or virtual space, there's a lot to be learned from how Disney has done that, and there's a lot of information available online about that.
one other thing about Disneyland, this is the original Disneyland. Disney World diverges from this a bit. Disneyland was designed right around the time of like the real hard-hitting resurgence of television. And it was actually designed around the principles of televisual entertainment. So the lands are the shows, and the commercials are the boundaries between the shows where you buy your hot dogs and kind of like refresh yourself. So if you actually look at a map of Disneyland, it's like bounded by this completely commercialized and like, you know, shilling area where they're going to sell you stuff, and you have to pass through each one of these boundaries to get to the next show.
Sort of on the design thought then of those visual indicators or other kinds of design indicators to do certain things, talking about bringing people into the role playing of Sanditon. You know, we have a web series, and most of the people who came to Sanditon presumably were coming from Lizzie Bennett Diaries. How did you go from, you know, we have a web series that you can follow, to we want you to not only participate and interact with the characters, but create your own personas, create your own, you're talking about like a music festival that happened, these 37 bookstores, like how did you get people to do that? That is a huge leap.
So we announced Sanditon, Lizzie Bennett had a Kickstarter, which was fantastic. It blew our expectations out of the water. And we announced Sanditon there, and we said it would be an interactive experience. We said it would be a place where you could become a character in the town. So we spelled it out pretty clearly. And then I think, so we had one video come out before the official series was supposed to. It was just the week before, and it was basically saying, hey guys, Sanditon's happening. Remember? Yeah. So, and it was one character who was literally road tripping to Sanditon and inviting, you know, kind of inviting you to come along. And that night there were a couple of people who made Sanditon Twitter accounts, and we were all, you know, on the edge of our seat like, oh, this is awesome, it's starting. And then we woke up and Sanditon had like a curling team. Like, there were so many more accounts when we woke up because people were just getting it. And we did worry about it. We were not expecting things to happen as quickly as they did, and I think we kind of took that as, oh, I guess we did our job better than we expected to. Whoops. So that wasn't the hard part. We also in the first video had one character be like, oh yeah, and if you're in Sanditon, maybe you should make a Twitter account. And so, you know, people did that, and also it was a little bit trickier to point people to the theatrics website, but it turns out that they will just click on links you give them. If you give them a link, they'll just be like, ooh, this is where I can find a dress that a character wore. Great, I will buy that dress. Or great, this is where I can make a character. Awesome, click. And then we had one video up there already, which was at a certain level in the Kickstarter, you got to buy an official Sanditon character. So one of our characters was one of our players at the same time. So she had the first video up. It was kind of like a diary entry, and other people followed suit. And so I think right now we have something like somewhere between 100 and 200 people on theatrics making videos.
Good.
We have, I think, let's see, 12 videos a page times like 78 pages, something like that.
Okay, yeah, that's not bad.
Not bad.
But like on that note, I mean, you look at Lizzie Bennett Diaries and the fact that every video had 200,000 views or more. I mean, we in talking about transmedia stuff, where I was talking about like the inverted pyramid of you have lots of people that are just watching, and you have a very small number of people who are actually doing anything. How have you seen? I mean, 200 people is pretty good to be making videos and playing roles. But have you seen that translate into, you know, like how have the viewers been reacting to that? The ones who aren't participating.
So we have different levels of participation. I'd say that the people who are making the videos are probably the ones who are like most participatory because they're putting their face up there. so we have somewhere between 100 and 200 of them, I think. We have, last I checked, around 650 Sanditon Twitter accounts. And the videos get at least tens of thousands of views. Some of them get, 6 digits. So and the Tumblr community, all of that, but it's the reaction to the people who are more involved is better. They tend to be the people who are more involved with the characters on the show because they are talking to them. They are participating in the same events as them, so they are more connected to both them and to this imaginary town of Sanditon, this imaginary space that Sanditon occupies. So the people who are more ingrained in Sanditon, the town, are more ingrained in Sanditon, the series.
Okay, I want to move on to JC, and I'm really interested in sort of the process as a writer and transmedia designer, but working with someone like Rob Jagnow, the psychologist magician.
Sounds like a superhero.
Amusingly, he's a really good friend of mine, and we played D&D together for years. But so I'm really interested in sort of that relationship and how you create a story with a designer like that. But I also want to drill down into a more potentially interesting question of the advertising connected with Byzantium included things like bus ads in New York that had the Byzantium slogan, which was, "We're not for everyone, just the 1% that matters." And I mean, you were creating an intentionally controversial space.
That debuted on the one-year anniversary of the
Occupy Wall Street.
Occupy Wall Street. Yeah, so
There's some
those
great
were
photos of
appearing
that.
those were appearing in the financial district as the protesters were protesting, and they were smashing things and smearing crap and putting stickers on them and like flipping them off and taking pictures of it. It was great.
So how did that come about in the design phase? And do you think there were negative ramifications of it, or was it more like any news is good news?
Yeah, no, I mean, for me, I was brought in very, very, very early on Byzantium, but not at a kind of like high level. The nuts and bolts marketing strategy stuff had already been kind of decided, right? And that's okay by me because I'm not a marketer as much as I am just a storyteller. And one of the things that they had decided to do was let's do some OOH or out of home, advertising, some bus and some billboards with this incendiary messaging on it. I don't know if Campfire knew that it would be happening during the 1-year anniversary of. I think that might have just been serendipity, the best kind of serendipity.
Yeah.
But that was a part of the strategy before I had come on board. What was the other? So
the process of, as a writer and designer, sort of coming into that then and working with other designers to craft this experience.
So the ramifications? Well, the ramifications were largely positive because we had people going who would see the website of byzantiumsecurity.com on these posters. They would visit the website and they would go down the rabbit hole and have their minds blown by our sleight of hand trick at the very end. There was a little bit of negative reaction, which was, "Oh, it's just for an effing TV show. Blah, I've been tricked." But largely, even those people were kind of successfully wooed by the weird head trip that we'd given them. So I mean, it was a big win. And more than anything else, it wasn't the people from Occupy Wall Street who were going to those sites that made that experience viral. It was that people were photographing protesters and the posters, and those photographs were then getting on like CNN and like laughing cops serendipitously standing next to these posters, right? Like looking all haughty, and that also helped kind of spread it. Regarding working with someone like Rob and the good folks at Campfire, that was a really interesting experience because he's an academic, he's a psychologist, and he's an illusionist. So he was coming from a very different kind of perspective. I was always saying like, well, how can we serve the story, right? I mean, I know that you've got this really these really great thought experiments and psychology tests, and the trolley test that we heard about earlier. That was something that we had discussed using as one of our psychological tests. But of these 30 that we've kind of concocted, these 30 options, which 5 seem to best serve the mood of kind of increasing dread, and that feeling of being watched, and the feeling of conspiracy, the themes that and like, you can't trust people, right? The sense of duplicity. All of that stuff are themes from the show. So we wanted to make sure that the tests that we used and the technologies that we used kind of serve the themes of the television program.
Cool, which is very much what we're talking about, that design together. Now we're only a couple minutes away from Q&A, so I want to sort of wrap up with sort of final thoughts from each of you. And I think I'll start with Andrew and wrap into this a question for you of, given what we're talking about and given some of these projects, and then given where you're coming from with this concept of boundary architecture and creating spaces, how does thinking of what we do as making a space affect how we should be making that space? In other words, what does a consideration of boundary architecture give us as far as tools or learning? And how can architectural theory be applied to make us all better and more thoughtful creators?
Okay. Yeah, as far as like, is there some sort of takeaway or like a book that you can just go read and like, oh, I'm now a good designer? No. But I think that good designers are hungry. They're always looking for like that hook, whether it's psychology, magic, or audience participation, or some sort of way to gate and deal with like both technological and narrative constraints in a creative way that's very harmonious. And so for me, I don't necessarily think that there's like, oh, go and study architecture and you'll be better at everything you do. But I do think that there's a lot of interesting kind of extra hooks in there for people who do end up reading and studying the spatial sides of these experiences. Mainly it comes down to a couple of philosophers, my favorite being Edward Soja, who kind of compiled bell hooks of feminist philosopher Foucault and Henri Lefebvre. And he basically kind of contextualized two situations. One of which is that we usually contextualize our experiences, both social and chronological or historical. And he says that now, as spatial considerations are getting less and less obvious, and I mean, the internet is a spatial thing. It exists both physically, but it also exists like physically, like this. The thing on my screen isn't actually physical, but it might as well be because my brain's reading it like a piece of paper. And so he's saying that consider the space. But he's also saying consider space in 3 ways instead of the traditional 2. Traditionally, we think of space as being either physical or not, like mental or physical. But really, there's a hybrid third space that's both physical and mental. And that's like most what ARG is. Like, you've got this reality and you've got this layer of unreality or hyper-reality over top of it. And that's actually a surprisingly poignant and also important thing to keep in mind, because you're no longer dealing with just the physical and the concrete, and you're also no longer dealing with an audience who takes things as one for one, like, oh, that's a chair, it's a chair. You're talking about an audience who's kind of grown up with the capability of there being meta conversations and meta existence with that spatial object.
Cool.
That makes any sense at all.
We have to just quickly wrap up. Before we do Q&As, I just want, like, if there's one takeaway that you want the audience to have, what would it be? JC?
Make sure that your design serves your narrative, and make sure that your narrative is complementing your design. You need to work with a theme, tone, that sort of thing. Make sure that they're as integrated and complementary as they can be.
Perfect. Dana?
If you are looking to populate a space that does not exist with real people, find ways that they can connect to it and to each other and build that space up in their minds, and the best thing that they could do for you is make a map.
Rob?
Figure out what it is that you're passionate about outside of ARGs and bring that inside, because there's a place for that in this community in a way that doesn't necessarily exist in other media forms.
Andrew?
I'm going to totally steal from someone I'm a big fan of, Porpentine, and at the end of her GDC talk, if you were lucky enough to see it, on freeindiegames.com, which she runs with Terry Kavanaugh of Super Hexagon. And she basically said, destroy everything. Throw away all definitions of what anything can be. Definitions are only ever controlled by the powerful and the privileged. And so I would say that, in my mind, professions are toxic to creativity. Forget what profession you are and start thinking about what discipline you come from. Forget the titles and the names and the definitions. Don't focus on what you're supposed to do. Focus on how you think, how you've been trained, and how that can influence and add to the conversation. I mean, this is a multidisciplinary pursuit. And so if I had to finish with a thought, it would be destroy everything and then rebuild better.
Awesome. Questions?
All right. Thank you very much, panel. One of the wonderful things about this panel is you guys cover a wide variety of how you want your players to interact with your game space. So we have user submissions being very minimal, and we have user submissions being very integral. What I want to know is, or I want you to talk about one of two things, either, and these are both keeping the player, your audience in mind. So when you're doing your design and creating your narrative, if you can come up with an example of a fail-safe you have purposefully and proactively put into your game space to make sure that the narrative doesn't fall to pieces, or if you could regale us with a story of when that didn't happen and you had to be reactive because your narrative was falling to pieces because of something you didn't anticipate.
I'm happy to start that. With Extrasolar, with our alpha testing, we found that some people were very interested in the story and some were not. And we found that giving them an explicit task list, which is like exactly what you have to do next, did not compromise the story content and allowed people to pursue, to move forward in the content, get the cool images, get the cool videos, and skip whatever they wanted. And nobody seemed to say that that compromised their experience. So that allowed us to reach out to a much broader set, a much larger audience, and still keep the extremely deep experience for those people who want to go behind, like follow all the links and the science content and all the articles.
We had Lucas and I had a bit of an experience with this with our Game Jam game, Encampment, where we wanted very quickly to make it to make the player aware of both the themes of the game, but also the Game Jam was I Am a Gamer, and the rules were you have to have a strong female protagonist. And when you have kind of a Mass Effect or Dragon Age scenario where the protagonist is whatever the hell you want it to be, it's kind of hard to be like, all right, but it's also strong because we said so. So we wanted to like add some hooks in there that like forced the player to A, step outside their comfort zone a bit, and B, really get a sense of what the character they're playing is, despite the fact that it's the character. So what we did is you're talking to characters in the story, and you go to ask them a question, and then they just reveal, like, kind of unprompted, that there's this kind of long-standing romance that's been brewing for years between you two, and you're like, oh, I didn't know that about myself. And it kind of puts the situation to where it totally breaks, like, kind of a cardinal social contract between game designer and game player, but we intentionally did that to give the player a better sense of the character they're playing, as well as a better sense of the themes of the story.
Yeah, like we wanted it to be specifically you're playing this character and you can influence how that character acts and where she is at the end of the story, but she has a history that you weren't part of and you are coming into the game with that.
So one thing that Sanditon does is we're a series of videos, and pretty much other than the user-generated content videos, which we compile every 2 weeks, like I said, the player doesn't have very much choice in what those videos are because we film them months in advance. So the player, through the story that we are telling as the Sanditon team, is one story in Sanditon. So that story doesn't really change. What changes are the stories that the players tell in Sanditon with each other, and there have been, like, there is an ongoing saga of this couple that's just gotten engaged and is planning their wedding in Sanditon, and they're involving like everyone in it, and it's another story in Sanditon. Ours is not the only one, and that's kind of how we have always viewed it. Ours is one of many.
I'm okay.
Other questions? We have tons of times for questions here, so ask away.
So, this is for JC.
I've said I'm good.
So I was one of the ones that drew the house, which was actually in there.
Yep.
And I mean, obviously statistically, kids are more likely to draw houses than anything else, so. But did you anticipate the replayability, that like all of us were going to decide that we had to see the monster and the dog
Yep.
and the boat and, okay.
Yep.